Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at World War II in our continuing study of world civilizations. I'd like to begin with Adolf Hitler. He, in his younger years, was an artist. I've heard that some of his paintings were quite good. I've never actually seen any of them. He was a soldier in World War I, where he served as a corporal with some distinction for his bravery and his leadership. But when the war ended, it took everybody, especially the Germans, by complete surprise because their own military had been telling them what a great job they were doing. They were about to win, and all of a sudden, Germany collapsed. And Hitler and many others too were convinced that they had been betrayed by their own people. And so in 1923, he leads a revolt, or I should say he's part of a revolt, the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. It fails, and he is arrested and spends a year in prison. And while he is in prison, he writes his epic book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And it sets forth his ideas for what he wants to accomplish in politics, in life, and in the world. By the time we get to the late 1920s, the entire world has been plunged into a Great Depression, and that was especially hard hitting in Germany. After all, Germany had been left with those huge war repatriations, the idea that they would have to bear the costs and pay back the costs for World War I, and it had left the country destitute. And so Hitler's political organization, the National Socialist German Workers, Nazi for short, became the ruling party in Germany. He becomes chancellor in 1933, and the following year he makes that into a permanent position, becoming now dictator. As dictator, he institutes a number of industrial programs. If all we had to look at were his economic moves, we might, and it had ended right there, we might have said, well, he was the strong leader that Germany needed and good for them. And many people at the time were looking at him and saying exactly that. Jobs programs, and yet he was also making preparations now for the next war. The Olympic Games were hosted by Germany in 1936, and Hitler used that as a public relations ploy to try to show how great the German athletes were, an entire race of supermen. Of course, it didn't always work out that way. Germans didn't win all of the Olympics, but they did give a good showing. The other thing we see about Hitler is his anti-Semitism. Now, this had already been an issue before he ever came to power. Anti-Semitism had been present in Europe for many decades, going back to the 1800s, but now it takes on a major impetus forward. Notice this propaganda piece notice the Talmud is, of course, one of the Jewish writings, sort of a collection of Jewish teachings. And you notice how you see very caricatured this satanic figure, and yet he is made to where he sort of resembles, just in some ways, the sort of Jewish features. Notice how this is called the recipe book of the devil. Here is another poster from that period. Notice it's dated 1938. And again, you have the stereotypical Jewish person. He's there with his hand out, like, just he wants to take and be given different things. And then notice this pamphlet, and notice this isn't coming from Germany, but this is entitled The Canadian Nationalists, just letting us know that this sort of Jewish propaganda was not specific only to Germany. And this is entitled The Mark of the Beast, and notice the Mark of the Beast is said to be this Star of David. So again, it's very anti-Semitic. Hitler enters into an alliance with both Italy and Japan. Now, for him to form an alliance with Italy, we have to remember that in World War I, Italy had been on the side of England and France, but they had been promised certain land grants, and those promises were not fulfilled at the end of World War I. And so now they change sides, and Mussolini, who's the prime minister slash dictator of Italy, enters into an alliance with Hitler, and then Japan comes on board as well, and the three of those will be known as the Axis powers. And so Germany begins to expand, first with the moving west into the Rhineland, this area that had been taken from Germany at the end of World War I. Next, they retake Austria. Hitler himself was Austrian. And then moving from then to take Czechoslovakia. And so we have Hitler beginning to expand Germany, both in military power and in the land areas that they would occupy. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England at the time, had a meeting with Hitler, negotiated what he felt was a peace, and he comes back announcing, "We have achieved peace in our time." Of course, it was not to be. Indeed, Hitler now invades Poland, and the war actually breaks out as England and France both declare war, but they're declaring war, but nothing's actually happening except that Hitler is invading the country of Poland to the east. And so he does this in 1939, and just 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, also occupies eastern Poland, and this is telling us that there was some sort of agreement. It had been secret, it had been planned, but now it comes to pass as Poland is split up between Germany in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. Remember, the Soviet Union, Russia, previously had been against Germany in World War I. Now they're on the side of Germany, although that's not going to last either. Now, as the war breaks out, one of Hitler's characterizations, this lightning war he calls it, the Blitzkrieg, is a combination of massed armor supported by tactical aircraft. In other words, you wouldn't have planes do their thing and then the tanks do theirs. They are all going to work together, and they are emphasizing both speed and power in this Blitzkrieg, means the lightning war. They're avoiding the trench warfare of World War I, and instead they will mass their forces to push through and break through, and then expand to envelop the enemy. Next, he turns his attention to both to Denmark, just on the northern edge of Germany, but also Norway, up in the Baltic region. And in early 1940, these fall to Germany. And now he attacks both England and France. Of course, England is on an island, but the French had built the huge Maginot Line, a series of huge fortifications on that border between France and Germany. Hitler just went around it. Notice they go through Belgium. Now, Belgium was supposed to be a neutral area, but it doesn't remain neutral because Hitler pushes through Belgium, goes around that Maginot Line, all the French fortifications, and France falls very quickly. And there were British forces on the west flank. These were cut off very quickly and pushed out to that. Notice that little area of Dunkirk. And they're going to have to evacuate or be captured. Now, Chamberlain, who had been the prime minister, he resigns as the conflict now breaks out. Winston Churchill becomes the new prime minister as the French are defeated, and they go very quickly. In just a matter of weeks and months, France falls, and the French enter into an alliance now with Germany, what we call Vichy France. The southern portion of France is allowed to be semi-independent, and of course the northern section and the western section, that's all going to now be occupied by Germany. The British that have been cut off at Dunkirk will be evacuated, and Churchill is going to refer to this as their finest hour, in that the bulk of the British armed forces, or they escape under fire, cut off. England sends every ship, every rowboat, everything they can get to evacuate these English forces, and they do manage to evacuate them. In his speech, Churchill says, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields, in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." And that resolve now was tested as Hitler prepared to attempt an invasion of England. But to do that, first of all, he would need air superiority. And so the Battle of Britain was not fought on land, but rather in the skies over England. It was a fight of fighter planes and German bombers. Later on, it was commented by Churchill, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And at the end of this Battle of Britain, this battle in the skies, England retained air superiority, barely by the skin of their teeth, but they did. They retained it, and in the invasion of England would be put off indefinitely, and instead Hitler would turn his attention in a different direction. And so in June of 1941, Hitler now launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. Remember that Germany and the Soviet Union had divided up Poland between themselves, but now he launches through eastern Poland and into Germany, three major directions at once. The northern direction moving toward Leningrad in the north, the central army moving toward Moscow, and the southern army moving into the Ukraine. The Russian forces were no match, and they began a very hasty retreat, and the Germans advanced for a number of months, almost unstoppable, until the winter set in, and that would change everything. But meanwhile, something was beginning. Remember that we talked about the anti-Semitism and the Jewish people, both in Germany and now in Russia and Poland, as those countries begin to fall. The Jewish people are rounded up and put into ghettos, that is, portions of the city where they would be walled off and concentrated together. With the invasion of the Soviet Union, we now have orders go out that all Jewish people that are captured would be exterminated. And so Russian Jews that are captured are just shot. They are put to death. At one point, the Germans are saying, "We're using too many bullets to shoot them. We have to find ways to save on ammunition and still kill the appropriate number." Concentration camps now begin to be the order of the day as the Jewish people are rounded up and placed into these concentrated areas. Notice the sign on the right picture, the Arbeit macht frei, that is, work makes free. It was a lie. Actually, they would work them to death. And when that didn't finish off the Jewish people, they would eventually have not just concentration camps, but they would have camps that were devoted to killing and murdering in this Holocaust against the Jewish people. These death camps would put into high gear where the Jewish people would be taken, they would be poisoned, they would be experimented on, many would be worked to death, and over the course of it, Hitler would succeed in putting more than 6 million Jewish people to death. His goal was nothing less than the extermination of what he saw as the Jewish race. So slave labor, poison gas, this was all done in secret. He was not publishing these things. He was doing this, keeping it secret. Word began to leak out, rumors at first, and people just couldn't believe that this was actually going on. Even those living in nearby towns sometimes were ignorant to the actual facts. Sometimes they would suspect, but it did not pay to pry too closely. Remember, they didn't have an open press. And so this was being done in secret, and yet the word began to get out. There's a picture of, I think this is probably the one in, although it's probably a repeated number of places, looks to me like the place in Dachau, where you would have these, you can't call them bunk beds because a bed signifies someplace where you've got a mattress. These were just sort of shelves for people to sleep on, and they would just be stacked together, being starved virtually to death, and then worked to death in this camp. Now, in December 1941, we have the Japanese launching a surprise attack. If Hitler had done his attack in Russia earlier that year, now the Japanese did an attack at Pearl Harbor against the United States, and this would bring the United States into the war. Initially, Japan succeeded in taking almost the entire Western Pacific. They moved down in the direction of Australia, but were stopped later on in early and mid 1942 at the Battle of Coral Sea. They had already taken large parts of China and what was called French Indochina, places that we think of today as Vietnam and Thailand and Burma. These had all fallen to Japan, and it was left to the Americans now to try to regain that offensive. They did regain it at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, where the Japanese assault was halted, and very slowly the Americans would begin to island hop their way back across the Pacific, but it would take years for this to be completed. Meanwhile, remember, we had the Soviet Union with with the invasion of Hitler into Russia and Ukraine. He came within 20 miles of Moscow, but could not complete the taking of that city. He next, the following year, diverted his forces to the south as they sought to take Stalingrad. The real goal was to the southeast of Stalingrad were the oil fields at Pulaski, but Stalingrad was the major city standing in his way, and this would be the turning point of the Russian campaign. The Battle of Stalingrad began August 1942. They had failed to take Moscow, as we mentioned, and a push now toward the Caucasus oil fields. Civilians were not evacuated. They were told, stay in place. Your job is to be there to fight against the Germans. If the Germans have passed you, then your job is to cut the supply lines so that the civilians are going to be treated as if they are military combatants, and in many cases they will be. The tractor factory in Stalingrad would continue as the Germans pushed into the city. People were still working on the factories. They were still cranking out tanks and military industry for this war. The Germans had complete air superiority at this point in history. And so if the Germans had not been able to beat the British in the Battle of Britain, they were winning here. And yet, as winter set in, that ground, again, for a second time in as many years, it ground the German advance to a halt. And as winter hit now, the Russians counterattacked with fresh troops coming from the east, from places like Siberia, and these fresh troops rolled up on either side of the German advance and cut them off. And at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans had lost a large portion of their army. And so that army was forced finally at the end to surrender. And so notice the map at its greatest expanse. We have Germany in control of everything from the Atlantic in France to Italy, and of course Italy had started off as being the ally of Hitler, but later when the Italian people turn against Mussolini, his German troops will come in and take over as they lose first Sicily. But notice coming from the east, we have the USSR. After the Battle of Stalingrad, they will begin a push that will take them without pause all the way into Germany before it is over. The greatest portion of World War II, the most casualties were on this Russian front. I'm not saying that was the only place where fighting took place, but it was the most divisions, the most soldiers that were fighting, and the heaviest casualties. The Allies had initially landed in North Africa. There they had fought against Rommel in 1940 and early 41. The Americans actually landed in Tunisia and Morocco in 1942, and from there they crossed over, taking Sicily and then into Italy as they began an advance. But it would not be until 1944 that they would actually do an invasion from England, what we call the Normandy invasion, this section of northern France, where a number of divisions would pass over. And when I say a number of divisions, that sounds a lot, until you put it up against the much greater number of divisions that had already been involved and were continuing to be involved on the Russian front. So I'm not downplaying the importance of D-Day and the Allied invasion there. And of course, as they did that invasion in France, a second maritime invasion was held in southern France. It didn't get nearly so much the press because this happened a few weeks later against much lesser forces, and yet it was still significant to close finally upon Germany. And the intent would be this pincer movement, the USSR coming from the east, both British, Americans, and there were even a few French troops, and there were troops involved from all over the world. So this really was a world war as they began to focus now upon advancing against Hitler in Germany. I want to spotlight Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German pastor, theologian who had received his doctorate in Germany at the age of 21. Brilliant young man, traveled to America, preaching, teaching, lecturing, and as Hitler rose to power, he was urged to stay in America and seek asylum, but instead he determined to return to Hitler's Germany, not because he was in favor of Hitler, but because he felt this was the place where Christians needed to be. And so there he was involved in what came known as the confessing church, that is the church that did not cater to and be politically correct using the teachings of the Nazi Party, but instead was resistant to some of those ideas. He was accused of being involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. I don't know if he was or not, but he was arrested, and what was discovered upon investigation is that he had been using funds to aid escaping Jews. These funds were traced back to him, and there I think he probably was involved in that at least, in trying to save Jews from Hitler, and that was considered being a traitor to Germany. And so he was placed in a concentration camp, and as the Allies advanced on Germany and as Germany was about to fall, he was executed. He was strangled with piano wire and gave his life. A quote from Bonhoeffer, he says, "To endure the cross is not tragedy, it is a suffering which is the fruit of an exclusive allegiance to Jesus Christ." And he's pointing out that sometimes your country can be wrong, And it's more important to keep your allegiance to Jesus than necessarily to your country. World War II in the Pacific would come to an end with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, one at Nagasaki, the other at Hiroshima. And within just days of this, the Japanese would enter into an unconditional surrender. That would change the world forever. Here's a photograph of Hiroshima. This was uh, now the first atomic war. We can call at least the ending of World War II an atomic war. Of course, at this point, the Americans were the only ones that had this weapon, and to date, they are the only ones that have ever used the weapon in actual combat. Now, the results of World War II. Well, first of all, we've made mention of genocide with the Holocaust, but there were war crimes both with Germany, and we mentioned about the Jewish people, but it was not limited to them. They were putting to death both Jews and Gypsies and all whom they saw as undesirables. Their the battle in the USSR against the Russians saw no quarter side. We also have Japan with their war crimes, and they had not signed into the agreements on how war ought to be fought and how prisoners ought to be treated. And so their view of, in fact, the fatality rate for being a Japanese prisoner was something like 25% of those who were captured were eventually killed in one way or the other. And of course, the USSR, and at the hands of Germany, sometimes they returned the favor of some of the barbarities that were involved there. And I don't want to pretend that there weren't others involved as well, although it was Germany and Japan that faced war crime trials because of the loser always was the one who was put on trial, and they had lost the war. Another result of World War II was that the world entered both the nuclear age, but also rocketry, where toward the end of the war, German scientists had developed rockets that could be some launched off of planes, but also from mobile platforms. And these V-2 rockets had been landing in London and other places in England. But that would continue, not just for warfare, but this would give rise to the space age and eventually putting people into the rockets. We're going to see this in the weeks to come as we look in the 1950s and 60s as first rockets go into space, and then people go in those rockets to go into space and eventually all the way to the moon. The other result of World War II is the United Nations. Now, this had been attempted with the League of Nations at the end of World War I, but it had not really had any teeth in the matter, and it had not prevented World War II. But the United Nations would now, this collection of nations that would band together and agree, at least at times, and so the United Nations was and still continues to be a force in the world that has had impact on at least to date. We have not entered into what we could call World War III, and that's a good thing. But this is also going to enter a new phase, not of a World War III, but of superpowers. There's going to be some new superpowers in the world. Instead of Germany, now we're going to see the United States, and then eventually the USSR, at least for a time, and also eventually China as these new superpowers. And instead of being at war with a great conflict as we saw in World War II, they're going to enter a period of what we could call the Cold War, where there will be conflicts, and sometimes that will have people going and fighting, and sometimes it will have an undercurrent of conflict behind the scenes. But that's going to continue to take place.